National Battlefield Park. I'm pleased that so many of you could come today. This is going to be a very busy day for the battlefield. I actually don't work here, but
he just hangs out.
I'm retired, but the staff here doesn't want me to waste my days sitting in front of my TV set, so they make me come down here and give tours. We're going to do a little orientation program first on the map behind me. But first of all, have any of you been here before? All right, good. I only have two people I have to remember what I said before. The War of 1812, how familiar are you with it? Are you all right, when was the War of 1812? Well, our battle, we have a state commission on the bicentennial of the War of 1812, and its mandate runs from June of 2012. We had a little event here to commemorate the start of the war, through July of 1815. And for those of you that know about the peace treaty and that stuff, do you have any idea why we might, for the Michigan bicentennial, go through the summer of 2015? Well, let me see. The peace treaty was signed in December of 1814, but then we had the Battle of New Orleans in January, and then the treaty was actually ratified in February. Let's see, we had the pacification ball in March up in Detroit.
So we keep the party going.
Keep the party going. Yeah. Okay, that's I didn't think of that one. Actually, in July of 1815 was when the British returned Mackinac Island to Michigan. 4 years, 3 or 4 years in a day after the start of the war. Lose count. Anyway, this little presentation will talk to you about some of the background to the Battle of the River Raisin, which will largely be on this map here, the general area map. And notice Michigan, of course, is still just a territory at about 5,000 settlers in the area. Then it will shift to this map that'll show you the details of the battle. So it will concentrate a lot on our problems with Native Americans. We were concerned about other issues such as freedom of the seas and impressment and that sort of thing, but of course the people here were mostly concerned about what would happen with the Native Americans and with the British out of Canada and their influence on the Native Americans. And this takes about 15 minutes. We'll go through it and open it up for questions afterwards. Take me a minute to... All right, thank you. Lights up, you'll see red and blue lights.
In the year 1811, American settlers were pouring across the Ohio River into the new states and territories which had been carved out of the Old Northwest. Reacting to this influx of land-hungry whites, large numbers of discontented Indians gathered around the prophet, a Shawnee who performed miracles and preached rejection of the white man's ways. Many frontier settlers feared these were signs a great war was coming. To prepare for this war, the prophet's brother, Tecumseh, began his grand project of uniting all the far-flung tribes into one mighty confederation. On November 7, 1811, a clash occurred at the prophet's village at Tippecanoe. There, General William Henry Harrison inflicted a severe defeat on the Indians. The battle did nothing to allay the general American opinion that British plotting and gun running was responsible for stirring up the Indians, and that the only real solution would be to seize control of Canada and drive the British off the continent. In April of 1812, the American Congress replied to British harassment on the high seas with an embargo and the mobilization of the state militias. On June 10th, General William Hull, governor of Michigan Territory, began moving a 2,000-man army from Dayton towards Detroit some 200 miles to the north. Cutting a road through the dreaded Black Swamp, the 2-mile-long column reached Frenchtown on July 2nd, where they learned that Congress had already declared war on Great Britain on June 18th, over 2 weeks earlier. The Frenchtown militia was called out to help work on Hull's road, enabling his army to reach Detroit on July 6, 1812. From Detroit, General Hull launched an invasion of Canada, capturing Sandwich, but failing to take the main British base at Fort Malden. Then on July 28th, Hull received word that the British had captured Fort Michilimackinac. Worse still, Indians loyal to Chief Tecumseh managed to cut Hull's vital supply road between Detroit and Frenchtown on the River Raisin, 40 miles to the south. Hull made 2 unsuccessful attempts to reopen the road, resulting in the battles of Brownstown and Mungwagon. Colonels Duncan MacArthur and Lewis Cass then tried to take a back trail to avoid the Indians, but they too failed to reach Frenchtown and had to retreat to Detroit. In the meantime, British General Isaac Brock had arrived at Fort Malden. With 330 British regulars, 400 militia, and 600 Indians under Tecumseh, he crossed the Detroit River to attack Hull's defenses. Unable to open his supply line and fearful of an Indian massacre of Detroit's civilian population, Hull surrendered his entire force without trying to defend the city. Meanwhile, General Winchester was hastily assembling a second American army of 2,000 citizen soldiers at Georgetown, Kentucky. Eventually, it would be placed under the command of the hero of Tippecanoe, Governor William Henry Harrison of Indiana. On August 19th, they marched northward to reinforce the Detroit garrison. 5 days later, they arrived at Newport on the Ohio River, only to receive the news that Detroit had already fallen. Still eager for the fight, however, the Kentuckians crossed the Ohio to Cincinnati and began an 80-mile trek to Pequot on the edge of the Ohio frontier. From there, they marched to relieve Fort Wayne, and then on up to secure Defiance, where they rebuilt Mad Anthony's old fort. By this time, plans were being formulated to recapture Detroit during the winter season, when British warships on Lake Erie would be unable to interfere because of the ice. General James Winchester was ordered to march the Kentuckians onto the Maumee Rapids to await the arrival of 2 other armies coming from southern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. Unfortunately for the Americans, however, events were to bring on an engagement before these armies could be united. When Winchester arrived at the rapids, he received word that a small force of British and Indians was occupying Frenchtown and committing depredations against American citizens. On January 18, 1813, Winchester dispatched Colonel Lewis across ice-covered Lake Erie from Presque Isle at the mouth of the Maumee. He arrived at La Pleasance with 667 men, mostly Kentuckians. Here he was joined by about 100 Frenchtown citizens who came gun in hand to help fight the British. Waiting for them along the north side of the River Raisin were about 75 Canadians from the Essex militia, a few regulars and artillerymen, 1 small cannon, and about 200 Indians, mostly Potawatomi. It was after 3 p.m. by the time the American line was formed and began to emerge onto the open prairie, a quarter-mile south of the river. The British cannon opened fire, followed by musketry, but the Americans continued to move forward, led across the slippery river ice by an advance guard under Captain Bland Ballard and by the local inhabitants. As they closed in, the British commander, Major Ebenezer Reynolds, began a stubborn retreat off towards the northeast. While the left and center of the American line were securing the buildings in Frenchtown, the right wing, under Colonel Allen, halted in an open field where they began receiving sniper fire from nearby buildings and fence rows. Allen ordered his men to fall back out of range of the Indians' muskets, but still within range of his own riflemen. Seeing Allen's difficulty, Colonel Lewis sent a column against the right flank of the enemy snipers. With this support, Allen ordered a charge which drove the Indians from the buildings and deeper into the forest. There, the fight continued from tree to tree, with the British occasionally able to bring their cannon into play, carefully withdrawing behind a screen of Indian skirmishers each time they fired. The fighting continued until darkness ended the action. Returning from the fight, the Kentuckians established their camp behind the fences of Frenchtown. At 2 a.m. on the 20th, General James Winchester arrived to take command. He established his headquarters at the home of Francis Navarre, 3/4 of a mile away on the opposite side of the river. Colonel Samuel Wells arrived with reinforcements about 12 hours later and made camp in an open field about 400 yards east of the other troops. No special precautions were taken to guard against a surprise counterattack other than to post the usual sentries. The British response to the loss of Frenchtown was not long in coming. Colonel Proctor, commanding Fort Norman, scraped together a force of 525 whites, 6 light field pieces, and about 800 Indians, mostly Wyandots and Potawatomis, led by Chiefs Roundhead and Walk in the Water. Leaving a handful of men behind to hold the fort, Proctor's men dragged their artillery across the ice of the Detroit River and headed for Frenchtown. Before dawn on January 22, 1813, Proctor's army deployed in the brush along Mason Run, several hundred yards north of the American camp. The British regulars held the center with militia and Indians on the flanks, and the artillery out in front. As the drums beat morning reveille in the American camps, the sentry suddenly noticed the approach of the British and fired into their ranks, putting a lead ball through the head of the lead grenadier. Proctor's artillery immediately opened up as the Kentuckians scrambled from their beds. 3 cheers from the British and war whoops from the Indians rang out as Proctor ordered his men to advance. The American regulars in the open field soon began to suffer heavily from the artillery and from musket fire coming from nearby buildings which had been occupied by Canadians and Indians. For 20 minutes, the regulars held their ground, until, flanked by a party of mounted Indians, they began to give way. At this moment, General Winchester arrived from his headquarters. The troops were ordered to fall back to a better position at the riverbank. The pressure on the regulars was too great, however, and the retreat became a rout. Reinforcements sent from the left wing were quickly caught up in the panic and swept across the river with the fleeing regulars. Several attempts were made to make a stand, but nothing could stop the oncoming enemy, whose mounted warriors outflanked them before any serious defense could be established. Colonel Allen was killed, General Winchester captured, and the last organized group of Kentuckians exterminated in an ambush near Plum Creek, a mile and a half south of the river. The captured Winchester, stripped of much of his clothing and nearly frozen, was taken to Colonel Proctor by the Indians. Meanwhile, sheltered behind puncheon fences which the British mistook for standing troops in the early morning darkness, the remaining Kentuckians had succeeded in throwing back the British attack. Twice more, the British regulars attempted to storm into Frenchtown, the last time in close order assault columns advancing to point-blank range, but each time they were driven back with heavy casualties. One British cannon was abandoned not 20 yards from the fence, and several Kentuckians ran out to capture it, but were driven off by British musket fire. Lieutenant Irving of the Provincial Marine, although wounded, finally managed to drag it back to the British lines. A number of Frenchtown civilians joined the fighting, doing considerable damage to the British by firing from the nearby buildings. One group at L'Enfant's Horse Mill on the American left was sent tumbling out of the building, however, when a shell from a British howitzer set the place on fire. Changing their strategy, the British shifted their artillery to their flanks and tried to capture some buildings between the lines which dominated the American positions. Accurate Kentucky rifle fire, however, forced the artillerymen to withdraw, and volunteers rushed out to burn the buildings before they could be occupied by the British. About 10 a.m., a lull descended on the field of battle. As the Kentuckians began to think about getting some breakfast, they noticed a British officer approach under a white flag. Major George Madison went out to meet him, expecting the British to ask for a truce to remove their dead and wounded. To his surprise, he was instead presented with a note from the captured General Winchester advising him to surrender. After some negotiation, the Kentuckians agreed to give themselves up upon condition that they and their wounded would be protected from the vengeance of the Indians. The British immediately rounded up their prisoners and herded them off to Fort Malden, leaving the wounded in Frenchtown under the care of some doctors and a small guard. Having removed their own wounded by sleigh, the British promised to return for the Kentuckians. The next morning, however, it was the Indians who returned. They ran from house to house, killing those too weak to walk, and taking others as personal captives. They also set fire to the buildings in Frenchtown, and many of the wounded died in the flames. Thus ended one of the most frightful disasters ever endured by an American army. Of 934 soldiers engaged in the battle, only 33 survived death or capture. The British regulars also had suffered severely. Already stretched too thin to effectively control all the territory they had conquered, their 24 dead and 169 wounded, including 11 officers, were losses they could ill afford. But through the summer of 1813, the strategic initiative remained with the British. Encouraged by his Indian allies, Colonel Proctor invaded Ohio, but American forces at Fort Meigs and Fort Stevenson were able to hold out, while a fleet was being built at Erie, Pennsylvania, to challenge British naval superiority on the Great Lakes. In September, the strategic situation was suddenly reversed when Commodore Perry won a startling victory on Lake Erie, capturing the entire British fleet and forcing Proctor to return to Fort Malden to avoid being cut off from this base by American control of the waterways. Time had come for the Americans to take their revenge. General Harrison ordered Colonel Richard M. Johnson at Fort Meigs to break camp and head for Detroit. Among his 1,000 mounted infantrymen were many refugees from the River Raisin. On their way north, they paused to view the charred, skeleton-littered remains of their once thriving settlement. At the same time, Harrison assembled 3,400 troops on Middle Sister Island and then had them transported by boat across Lake Erie to Canada. Proctor abandoned Detroit and Fort Malden and fled eastward into Ontario, toward a spot on the Thames River where he finally agreed to Chief Tecumseh's demands to turn and face their pursuers. The result was the Battle of the Thames, fought on October 5, 1813. The critical moment of the battle came during the initial charge of Johnson's cavalrymen, who were seen to hesitate as they came under British fire. Suddenly, above the din, came the cry, "Remember the Raisin." The men spurred their horses forward and broke the thin British line, followed by the infantry. British resistance crumbled as Colonel Proctor fled the field. The Indians fought on until forced to scatter into the woods, leaving behind 33 dead, including the body of their beloved leader, Tecumseh. The British lost 12 killed, 36 wounded, over 600 prisoners, and almost all their baggage, wagons, and guns, and ample revenge for the American losses at Frenchtown the previous winter. After this battle, the lower Great Lakes remained securely under American control until the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war on December 24, 1814.